January 17, 1943, somewhere over the gray waters of the English Channel. The cockpit of the Focke-Wulf FW-190 trembled with engine vibration as Oberleutnant Klaus Hartmann leveled his fighter at 22,000 feet. Below him, the cold waters stretched like hammered steel beneath broken clouds. His gloved hand rested lightly on the control column, a gesture born not of caution, but of confidence. Hartmann had flown 73 combat missions. He had painted 11 enemy aircraft silhouettes beneath his canopy rail. The leather of his flight jacket still smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and machine oil from the morning briefing at Abbeville-Drucat. In that briefing room, beneath maps marked with red and blue chalk, he and his staffel had laughed at intelligence reports describing American pilot training. 6 months, the reports said, sometimes less. Farm boys and factory workers crammed into cockpits with barely enough flight hours to qualify as competent, let alone dangerous. The laughter had been easy, unforced. The Luftwaffe trained its pilots for years. Hartmann himself had logged over 400 hours before his first combat sortie. He adjusted his oxygen mask and scanned the horizon, expecting nothing more than another routine patrol. He did not know that within minutes, he would witness something that would unravel every assumption he carried into that winter sky. The war in Europe had reached a peculiar inflection point by early 1943. Germany still held vast territories, from the frozen steppes outside Stalingrad to the Atlantic coastline of France. Yet the tide, imperceptible to most but undeniable to those who studied logistics and production charts, had begun its slow, irreversible turn. The United States had entered the war 14 months earlier, and while its ground forces remained largely untested in the European theater, its industrial capacity had already begun to reshape the arithmetic of the conflict. American factories were producing aircraft at rates that defied European comprehension. In 1942 alone, the United States manufactured over 47,000 military aircraft. Germany, by comparison, produced 15,000, but numbers on paper meant little to men like Hartmann. Numbers did not bleed. Numbers did not panic when tracer rounds stitched through a fuselage. What mattered in the cockpit was skill, experience, and the cold mathematics of aerial combat, energy management, deflection shooting, situational awareness. And by every measure the Luftwaffe valued, American pilots were inferior. This was not propaganda. This was observable fact, documented in combat reports from North Africa to the occupied Channel Islands. American formations flew predictably. Their pilots lacked the aggressive instinct that defined German fighter doctrine. They clung to their bombers like nursemaids, defensive and cautious. The few who broke formation to engage often made elementary mistakes, poor energy discipline, telegraphed maneuvers, hesitation at the merge. Hartmann had seen it himself over deep. An American P-38 pilot had attempted a head-on pass, then inexplicably pulled up early, bleeding speed and exposing his ventral surfaces. Hartmann had destroyed the aircraft with a 2-second burst. Afterward, he felt something close to pity, but pity was a luxury the winter of 1943 would not permit. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt entered operational service with the 8th Air Force in April 1943, though isolated units had begun flying the type earlier in limited numbers. It was, by any standard, an absurd machine. It weighed 7 tons empty, twice the weight of a Spitfire, nearly as much as some medium bombers. Its radial engine, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, generated 2,000 horsepower and required a turbocharger system so complex that early maintenance crews referred to it with a mixture of reverence and profanity. The aircraft's fuselage was so broad that pilots joked about feeling like they were flying a milk jug. German intelligence officers, reviewing captured technical manuals and reconnaissance photographs, dismissed the P-47 as a design aberration, an American attempt to brute force their way past the subtleties of fighter aerodynamics. The plane's sheer mass suggested it would be ponderous in a turning fight, easy prey for the lighter, more nimble FW-190 and BF-109. Early engagement reports seemed to confirm this assessment. In the spring of 1943, Luftwaffe pilots claimed multiple P-47 kills, often describing the American aircraft as sluggish and unwilling to engage below 15,000 feet. What the Germans did not yet understand, what they could not understand from technical specifications alone, was that the P-47 had not been designed to fight the way Luftwaffe doctrine anticipated. American pilot training had evolved rapidly since Pearl Harbor. The early curriculum, hastily assembled in 1942, had indeed been abbreviated and crude. But by 1943, a new generation of flight instructors, many of them combat veterans rotated back from the Pacific and North African theaters, had begun refining American tactics around a fundamental principle: energy retention. The Germans and British had long understood energy fighting, but they practiced it within the constraints of their aircraft's capabilities and their tactical doctrines. The Americans, unburdened by years of established doctrine and equipped with an aircraft that excelled at high-altitude performance, developed something different. They taught their pilots to fight vertically, to dive from altitude with devastating speed, fire a concentrated burst from 8.50 caliber machine guns, and then use the kinetic energy of the dive to zoom back to altitude before the enemy could react. They called it boom and zoom, though the term would not enter common usage until later. The tactic exploited the P-47's two greatest strengths: its ability to dive faster than any operational fighter in the European theater, and its capacity to absorb punishment that would destroy lighter aircraft. The Thunderbolt's airframe could withstand dive speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. Its cockpit was surrounded by armor plating. Its fuel tanks were self-sealing, its engine able to function with multiple cylinders destroyed. American pilots were taught not to dogfight, not to turn with German fighters, not to play the enemy's game. They were taught to impose their own rules on the engagement, to dictate the terms through altitude and speed. Hartmann first saw a P-47 engage this way on March 8, 1943, over the Belgian coast. His Staffel had been vectored to intercept a formation of B-17 bombers returning from a raid on Rouen. The bombers were strung out, some trailing smoke, their formations ragged after flak and fighter attacks over the target. Hartmann's flight was diving to attack a crippled fortress lagging behind the main group when his wingman's voice crackled over the radio. Indianer high, 7 o'clock. Hartmann glanced back and up. 4 P-47s, perhaps 5,000 feet above, tracking parallel to the bomber stream. They did not dive immediately. They did not take the bait of the vulnerable bomber. They waited. Hartmann made a decision that, in retrospect, illustrated the cognitive gap between doctrine and reality. He assumed the American pilots were hesitant, uncertain. He broke off his attack on the bomber and began a climbing turn, intending to gain altitude and force the P-47s into a defensive position. It was a maneuver he had executed dozens of times against British Spitfires. Use the FW-190 superior roll rate to spiral upward, bleed the enemy's speed, force a turning engagement where German experience would dominate. But the P-47s did not behave like Spitfires. They did not follow his climb. Instead, as Hartmann's airspeed dropped below 200 miles per hour in his climbing spiral, the lead Thunderbolt rolled inverted and dove. Not a shallow dive, not a cautious pursuit curve, but a near-vertical plunge, engine screaming, the roar audible even through Hartmann's own engine noise and helmet padding. The P accelerated with shocking rapidity, its massive weight becoming an asset rather than a liability. Hartmann saw the tracers before he consciously registered the threat, a stream of incandescent orange slashing through the air to his right. He snap-rolled left, pushed the stick forward, felt the negative G-force press him against his harness straps. The P-47 flashed past him, a gray-green blur, so close he could see the stenciled serial numbers on its fuselage. Then it was gone, pulling up in a zoom climb so steep it seemed to defy physics, trading its dive speed for altitude in a pure conversion of kinetic to potential energy. That evening, in the operations tent at Naval, Hartman tried to articulate what he had experienced. His squadron mates listened with skepticism bordering on disbelief. One of them suggested that Hartman had simply been caught out of position. Another proposed that the American pilot had been lucky. But Hartman knew what he had felt in that moment, the specific flavor of vulnerability. He had been outmatched not by superior skill in the traditional sense, but by an aircraft and tactical system that invalidated his advantages. The P-47 pilot had not needed to turn with him, had not needed to match his experience or intuition. The American had simply needed to dive faster and climb better than Hartman could follow, and the P-47 could do both. This was the beginning of a pattern that would repeat itself, with increasing frequency and lethality, over the spring and summer of 1943. Luftwaffe pilots continued to score kills against P-47s. The Thunderbolt was not invincible, but the ratio of losses began to shift. More importantly, the psychological impact began to accumulate. German fighter pilots, accustomed to dominance, found themselves forced to fight defensively, to constantly check their altitude and 6 o'clock, to abandon attacks on bombers because American escorts were diving from above. The P-47, with its brutal simplicity of purpose, had introduced a new variable into the aerial battlespace: vertical energy dominance. And it was being flown by pilots who, despite their limited experience, had been trained to exploit that single advantage with ruthless efficiency. The mock battles conducted at training bases across the American Southwest had prepared these pilots for exactly this kind of warfare. At Thunderbird Field in Arizona, at Luke Field outside Phoenix, at the sprawling training complexes in Florida and Georgia, American instructors had constructed a curriculum designed around replicating the conditions their students would face over Europe. They used P-40s and early model P-47s to simulate enemy fighters, flying aggressive intercepts against formations of training bombers. They taught deflection shooting not with abstract mathematics but with repetitive practice, burning through thousands of rounds of ammunition until the sight picture became instinctive. They emphasized discipline over individual heroism, formation integrity over lone wolf aggression, and they drilled their students endlessly on energy management, how to recognize when you had an energy advantage, how to preserve it, how to convert it into a killing position. The training was not sophisticated in the European sense. It did not produce pilots with hundreds of hours and an encyclopedic knowledge of aerodynamic theory, but it produced pilots who understood their specific aircraft and their specific mission with machine-like clarity. German pilots, briefed on American training methods through intelligence summaries, found the whole system baffling and faintly contemptible. 6 months to produce a fighter pilot. Impossible. What emerged from such abbreviated programs could not be warriors, could not possess the cultivated instincts that defined aerial combat mastery. And yet, the evidence mounted. By June 1943, the 8th Air Force's P-47 squadrons were flying deep escort missions into Germany itself. Luftwaffe interception rates against American bomber streams began to decline. German fighters, harassed by Thunderbolts with altitude advantage, were forced to engage under unfavorable conditions or break off entirely. The strategic calculus of daylight bombing, which had seemed untenable in 1942, was shifting. Not because American bombers had become invulnerable, but because their escorts had learned to control the vertical battlespace. There is a particular kind of cognitive dissonance that occurs when reality contradicts deeply held professional beliefs. Luftwaffe pilots, confronting P-47 tactics, experienced this dissonance as a kind of betrayal, a violation of the implicit rules that governed aerial combat. Dogfighting in the European tradition was an art form. It required finesse, timing, and almost musical sense of rhythm. The Americans had reduced it to something crude and industrial. They dove from above, fired, and left. There was no elegance in it, no test of skill. And yet it worked. It worked with brutal, undeniable effectiveness. Hartmann, flying his 100th mission in July 1943, found himself adopting tactics he would have scorned a year earlier. He flew higher, constantly scanning above and behind. He avoided prolonged engagements, breaking off at the first sign of P-47's diving from altitude. He stopped mocking American pilots in briefings. The jokes had soured, replaced by a grim pragmatism. Survival, not honor, had become the primary objective. The symbolic weight of the P-47 extended beyond its tactical effectiveness. To German pilots, the Thunderbolt represented something more unsettling than a mere weapons system. It was a manifestation of American industrial philosophy. Heavy, over-engineered, produced in staggering quantities, and operated by pilots who treated the aircraft not as an extension of themselves, but as a tool, a platform for delivering firepower. There was no romance in the American approach, no cult of the ace, no emphasis on individual artistry, just mass production and systematic application of force. In a strange way, the P-47 embodied the democratic ideal translated into military hardware. It did not require an aristocracy of skill to operate effectively. It required competence, discipline, and an acceptance of standardized tactics. Any reasonably capable pilot, given adequate training, could fly a P-47 and contribute to the mission. The aircraft's ruggedness forgave mistakes. Its firepower compensated for imperfect marksmanship. Its speed and climb rate provided escape options for pilots who found themselves in trouble. It was, in essence, a fighter designed for a citizen air force rather than a warrior elite. And it was winning. By autumn 1943, the transformation in German fighter tactics was complete. Luftwaffe doctrine had evolved, or devolved, depending on one's perspective, into a defensive posture centered on avoiding American fighter sweeps and concentrating attacks on bombers during brief windows of vulnerability. The days of arrogant, swaggering confidence were gone. In their place was a grinding, attritional struggle in which German pilots, despite their experience and skill, found themselves outnumbered, outproduced, and increasingly outfought. The Luftwaffe's kill-to-loss ratio against American fighters deteriorated steadily throughout 1943 and into 1944. Experienced pilots were killed or captured at rates that could not be replaced. Training programs, already strained by fuel shortages and the diversion of resources to the Eastern Front, began producing pilots with even less preparation than their American counterparts, but without the advantage of superior aircraft or tactics to compensate. The psychological impact on individual German pilots varied. Some, like Hartmann, adapted through grim professionalism, treating each mission as a problem to be solved rather than a contest to be won. Others succumbed to fatalism, flying with reckless aggression born of despair. Still others requested transfers to other fronts, preferring the brutal simplicity of the Eastern Front's ground attack missions to the nerve-shredding altitude battles over Germany. What united them was a recognition that the war they had trained for, the war they had expected, was over. The new war, the American war, was something different. It was industrial, impersonal, and relentless. There exists a combat report, filed by Hauptmann Friedrich Lang of JG2, dated November 12, 1943, that captures this shift with particular clarity. Lang describes an engagement over Schweinfurt in which his swarm of 4 Bf-109s attempted to intercept a formation of B-17s. The bombers were escorted by what Lang estimated as 20 to 30 P-47s, stacked in layers from 25,000 to 35,000 feet. Lang's flight climbed to attack altitude, but before they could position for a bombing run, the high P-47s dove. They came down like stones, Lang wrote, not in formation but in a cascading sequence, each pilot timing his dive to maintain continuous pressure. We could not climb to meet them without losing speed and becoming vulnerable. We could not turn away without exposing ourselves to stern attacks. We could not dive, because that was their domain. For the first time in my career, I understood what it meant to have no tactical options. We jettisoned our external tanks and fled east at full throttle, pursued by two thunderbolts who broke off only when we crossed into the flak belt over Castle. We did not fire a single round at the bombers. We did not even see them clearly. We were too busy surviving. Lang's report was one of hundreds filed that autumn, each documenting variations on the same theme: tactical paralysis in the face of American altitude superiority. The P-47, far from being the lumbering, overweight brute that German intelligence had predicted, had become the dominant fighter in the European theater's high-altitude battle space. Its pilots, far from being the incompetent novices that German doctrine had assumed, had proven capable of executing their mission with mechanical precision. The entire edifice of assumptions that had supported Luftwaffe confidence had collapsed, not through a single dramatic defeat, but through 1,000 small engagements in which reality contradicted expectation. This phenomenon, the gap between anticipated and actual performance, highlights a deeper truth about institutional learning and doctrinal rigidity. The Luftwaffe had built its training system around producing individually excellent pilots capable of improvisation and independent action. This system had worked brilliantly in the war's early years, when German pilots faced opponents who were equally individualistic and often less prepared. But it was not a system designed to counter an opponent who emphasized standardization, mass production, and tactical simplicity. The Americans had accepted from the outset that most of their pilots would not be aces, would not possess extraordinary natural talent, would not achieve the individual kill totals that German pilots accumulated. Instead, they built a system that maximized the effectiveness of average pilots operating in coordinated units with clear, repeatable tactics. The P-47 was the perfect aircraft for this system. It did not demand exceptional skill to fly competently. It did not require years of training to employ effectively. It simply required pilots to do what they had been trained to do: maintain altitude, dive fast, shoot straight, and climb back to safety. The cumulative effect of dozens of pilots executing this simple playbook was devastating. The sound of a P-47 in a dive became, for German pilots, a harbinger of chaos. The double Wasp engine's roar, Dopplering as the fighter plummeted from altitude, was distinct from any other aircraft in the theater. Those who heard it learned to react instantly: jettison external stores, firewall the throttle, begin evasive maneuvers before even acquiring a visual on the attacker. But often, by the time the sound registered, the engagement was already decided. The P-47's 8 machine guns, synchronized to converge at 300 yards, could shred an aircraft's control surfaces in a 2-second burst. Pilots who survived such attacks described the experience as less like being shot at and more like being caught in an industrial accident: a sudden, mechanical violence that left aircraft unflyable and airframes shuddering. The Thunderbolt's firepower was not elegant, but it was utterly conclusive. As 1943 gave way to 1944, the strategic implications of American air superiority began to manifest beyond the immediate aerial battlefield. The Luftwaffe's inability to contest daylight operations meant that German war production facilities, rail networks, and oil refineries were subjected to systematic destruction. Fighter production could not keep pace with losses. Pilot training was further abbreviated, creating a death spiral in which less prepared pilots died faster, depleting the training cadre and perpetuating the cycle. By the time of the Normandy invasion in June 1944, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self, still dangerous in isolated engagements, still capable of local successes, but strategically irrelevant. The sky over Europe, once Germany's domain, had become an American highway. The irony, bitter and inescapable, was that German pilots had been correct in their initial assessment of American training. 6 months was insufficient to produce a truly skilled fighter pilot. The American system did churn out aviators with limited experience and rudimentary tactical knowledge. But the Germans had made a fatal error. They had assumed that limited training equated to limited effectiveness. They had failed to account for the possibility that a well-designed tactical system, paired with superior equipment and overwhelming numbers, could compensate for individual deficiencies. The Americans had not tried to outfight the Germans on German terms. They had simply changed the terms of the fight. There is a photograph, taken in late 1944 at a Luftwaffe base in Bavaria, that circulated among German fighter squadrons with grim humor. It shows a P-47 that had force-landed in a field after being damaged by flak. The aircraft is riddled with holes, 37 documented strikes, including several that penetrated the engine cowling and wing roots. And yet the plane had flown for 40 minutes after sustaining this damage, allowing its pilot to reach friendly territory and execute a controlled crash landing. The pilot walked away uninjured. German pilots, viewing this photograph, understood its message. The Americans could afford to lose pilots and planes at rates that would cripple the Luftwaffe, and even when they did lose an aircraft, the pilot often survived to fly again. It was a calculus of attrition that Germany could not win. In the final months of the war, as the Third Reich collapsed, some German pilots encountered P-47s one last time in circumstances far removed from combat. Advanced American airbases, established on captured German airfields, often hosted captured or defected Luftwaffe pilots who were being interrogated or awaiting processing. These men, stripped of rank and purpose, sometimes watched American ground crews service the thunderbolts that had hunted them. They observed the casual efficiency of American maintenance procedures, the abundance of spare parts, the sheer volume of aircraft being prepared for missions. One such pilot, whose name was not recorded in the historical record but whose testimony was preserved in a post-war interview, described watching a P-47 squadron return from a mission. 3 aircraft had been damaged, one with its tail section nearly severed by cannon fire, another trailing smoke from a shattered cylinder, a third with hydraulics failure requiring a belly landing. All 3 pilots survived. Within 2 days, 2 of the aircraft had been repaired and returned to service. The third was cannibalized for parts, its fuselage pushed aside to make room for a new P-47 ferried in from a depot in England. "We would have mourned such losses," the German pilot said. "We would have held ceremonies, written letters to families, contemplated the waste. The Americans simply brought in another plane. That was when I understood we had never had a chance." They were not better warriors, they were better at war. This distinction, between being good at fighting and being good at war, defines the P-47's legacy. The Thunderbolt was not the most elegant fighter of World War II. It was not the most maneuverable, not the most aesthetically pleasing, not the most celebrated in popular imagination. But it was, in its blunt, American way, the most effective at translating industrial capacity into aerial supremacy. It was a weapon designed not for individual glory but for collective victory. And in that design, it reflected the society that produced it, pragmatic, abundant, and uninterested in the romance of warfare. The P-47 won not by being beautiful or inspiring, but by being good enough, produced in overwhelming numbers, and flown by pilots who had been trained to accept their role as components in a larger system. It was democracy's answer to aristocracy, industry's answer to artistry. And it worked. The final truth, the one that Hartmann and Lang and thousands of other Luftwaffe pilots came to understand in the skies over Europe, was that mockery of American training had been a form of denial. It was easier to laugh at the enemy's perceived incompetence than to confront the deeper reality that the Americans had built a system capable of producing competent pilots faster than Germany could kill them, and had paired those pilots with aircraft that negated traditional measures of skill. The laughter had stopped by 1944. By then, there was only the sound of double Wasp engines diving from altitude, and the desperate radio calls of German pilots trying to evade what could not be evaded. The sky, which had once seemed infinite and free, had become a cage defined by altitude and energy states, and the Americans held the keys. In the end, the P-47 Thunderbolt did not defeat the Luftwaffe through technological wizardry or tactical genius. It defeated the Luftwaffe through the simple, grinding application of a well-designed system, executed by adequately trained pilots who understood their mission and trusted their equipment. It was a victory of process over flair, of repeatability over improvisation, of abundance over scarcity. And it was, in every sense, an American victory, not because Americans were inherently superior as pilots or warriors, but because they had built a way of war that aligned with their strengths and exploited their enemy's weaknesses. The P-47 was the hammer, and the Luftwaffe, for all its skill and courage, was the nail. The outcome was never really in doubt, once the first Thunderbolt dove from altitude and climbed away unscathed. The rest was just repetition, mission after mission, until there was nothing left to fight,